Did any of you try to see the eclipse this past Monday? Maybe a few of you. Well, it was a bit cloudy that day, so I wasn't all that confident that we would see any of the partial eclipse. My parents and my two youngest siblings, they actually went all the way down to Arkansas so that they could be in the path of totality, and they actually had perfect weather, so they were able to see the full total eclipse. I was actually saying Mass over at the Randolph nursing home during the time of the totality. And as I was leaving the nursing home, the clouds parted for a bit, and I was able to use the solar glasses and see the partial eclipse. To see a total eclipse, if you've never seen one, that's an even more amazing thing than just a partial one. Maybe some of you in 2017 happened to travel a bit west or south when that eclipse went through the state of Nebraska. Of course, if you stayed up here in Plainview, you would not have seen all of the phenomenon that are associated with the total eclipse. You just had the partial alone. Some of the phenomenon includes how it becomes dark right there in the middle of the day. And I bring up this about the eclipse not only because that's my background in physics and astronomy before I became a priest, but also because there were some Christians who kind of took the meaning of the eclipse to the extreme. Proposing all sorts of prophetic meanings, including perhaps even the end of the world. Of course, we're still here. And so skeptics could come away thinking that Christianity is false or irrational. St. Thomas Aquinas actually warned against trying to defend the Christian faith using arguments that are so patently opposed to reason that the faith is made to look ridiculous and deserving of scorn. Skeptics are always looking for reasons to deny the reasonableness of the Christian faith. For example, in the gospel accounts of the crucifixion that we just meditated upon through Holy Week, leading to his resurrection, Matthew and Mark tell us that from noon until 3 p.m, darkness covered the whole land. And in Luke's gospel, he gives a reason for the darkness. He says, because of an eclipse of the sun. Now, if you've seen the eclipse, you might ask, well, what's wrong with that? This kind of makes sense. During the total eclipse, the moon moves between the earth and the sun, and so it blots out the sun's light, and it causes darkness, as I mentioned earlier, in the middle of the day. So it seems to match with what the gospel says. But the problem is that eclipses are a pretty short phenomenon. Monday's eclipse only lasted for 4.5 minutes, if you were there in the path of totality. And the one in 2017 here in Nebraska only lasted 2.5 minutes. And the longest that an eclipse could possibly be is 7.5 minutes in any location. But the Gospels say that this darkness at Jesus' crucifixion lasted for 3 hours. So it doesn't seem to fit an eclipse. Second, they would say, well, an eclipse, a solar eclipse, can only occur during a certain phase of the moon. It has to be a new moon. But Jesus was crucified during the time of the Jewish Passover, which the date is always calculated using the exact opposite phase of the moon, the full moon. And so Passover and therefore Jesus' crucifixion would have coincided with the full moon of that year, and thus the darkness could not have been due to a total solar eclipse. It's just not physically possible. And so someone might say, if Luke made that kind of mistake about an eclipse at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, then how can we trust him about all the other things that he says? Like the resurrection of Jesus, or like what we hear Luke tell us in the gospel passage today about Jesus' appearances after his resurrection. The Bible doesn't seem to be trusted to tell us what's true. And so maybe the whole thing is just made up. So would say a number of our scientific atheists today. So is that right? Is the Bible in error? Did Luke make a mistake? Well, no. It's more likely that we're the ones who are misunderstanding what he wrote. Luke didn't write in English, he wrote in Greek. And the phrase there would have been tuo heliou eklipontos. not very good at Greek. The English word eclipse actually does come from the Greek word that he uses, eklippontos. But its original meaning wasn't the same as the way we use it today. It would have been translated basically as after the sun had failed. So it didn't necessarily have the specific scientific meaning that eclipse of the sun means for us now. And so the translation is a little bit misleading in English. Luke tells us really that the darkness covered the land after the sun failed. But he doesn't tell us how it failed. He probably didn't know exactly how it failed. We don't have any more information than that, but we need to admit that it couldn't have been just a naturally occurring total eclipse like we had this past Monday. If we try to claim that, then skeptics will think we're being unreasonable, and therefore our faith must be as well. But rather, we don't have to insist upon it being a naturally occurring eclipse. I suppose maybe it could have been other naturally occurring phenomena like clouds or a dust storm. But it also could have been that God caused a special miraculous appearance of maybe even an eclipse-like miraculous phenomenon by which the sun's light failed. He certainly could do that. He's God. Interestingly, while a solar eclipse could not have occurred at Jesus' crucifixion, since it was a full moon, a lunar eclipse can. A lunar eclipse occurs when the Earth's shadow falls onto the surface of the moon. And using the gospel evidence, Jesus was probably crucified on April 3rd of AD 33. And doing mathematical calculations, there actually was a partial lunar eclipse that would have been able to be seen from Jerusalem that night. Today's first reading is one of Peter's speeches, and the chapter right before the one we have today was his speech as well on Pentecost. And in that speech, he quotes one of the prophets, the prophet Joel. God says, "I will work wonders in the heavens above. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood." I don't know if you know what it looks like when a lunar eclipse occurs. When the Earth's shadow falls upon the moon appears reddish. The moon appears like it's turned to blood. And so perhaps Joel and Peter, who's quoting him, are alluding to a lunar eclipse that occurred on the night of Jesus' death, and that God, in this case, was using both a natural phenomenon with the moon and a miraculous one with the sun. Well, all this talk about the moon and the sun is fascinating, at least for me. Hopefully you found it interesting a little bit. You didn't know you'd get a physics lesson today. Our faith, though, doesn't rest on scientific investigations of physical phenomenon. It doesn't depend upon seeing everything with our eyes. The partial solar eclipse on Monday, it was there, even though we couldn't, by just looking with our bare eyes, see it at all. If you didn't know that it was happening on Monday, you would not have noticed anything different at all. But using our reasoning, we knew when it would happen, and so we could then be prepared and look through those special glasses and be able to see that crescent of the moon in front of the sun. And faith is kind of like that. We walk by faith, not by sight, St. Paul says. Our faith rests on God himself, who can neither deceive us nor be deceived. We trust what God says is true, and we use our reasoning to help support what he says. And just like sight fails with regard to the sun above, so too human sight fails with regard to the Son of God. When Jesus appeared after his resurrection, as we hear in the Gospels like today's, at first the apostles, the disciples' eyes were prevented from recognizing him. But then their eyes were opened. In particular, in one case, in the breaking of the bread. The partial eclipse was there on Monday, whether we looked through the special glasses or not. And in the same way, Jesus was there both before and after they recognized him. In a sense, faith is our special glasses that we need in order to see God's presence. The presence of the one who's always there, regardless of even if we might struggle to see. We don't believe because we saw the resurrection with our own eyes or have placed our fingers into his nail marks in his hands or side. We believe because we know him. We believe because we meet Jesus in prayer. We believe because Jesus makes himself known to us here in the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist. And it is through this growth in relationship with Jesus that we have come to know that he is alive.